The building behind me contains one of Australia's biggest exports. It's not coal, it's not education, but rather $200 billion in assets managed. These are the offices of IFM Investors, one of the largest asset managers in the world and the go-to for Australian superannuation funds. Chances are your money has ended up in that building. Australian superannuation funds hold $4.2 trillion in assets. So theoretically, Australians have $4.2 trillion ready for their retirement. In the previous video, we discussed how traditional accounts such as GDP can't entirely encapsulate the dominant players in contemporary Australian capitalism. And then we discussed some of those players, namely property. In this video, we're going to talk about the second largest section of the Australian economy, that being superannuation, and then discuss the increasingly cozy, smoochy relationship between these two hegemonic factions. Superannuation is Australia's main retirement system. Essentially, when you work a job, your employer sets aside a portion of your wage and then gives it to a superannuation fund, so for example, Australian Super. That fund then uses that money to invest it in a wide variety of assets, the returns of which you then get to access when you retire. Initially, Super was quite embryonic and local to select white-collar workers, with the first proposal for a universal superannuation scheme actually being proposed by the conservative Bruce government in the 1920s. Nonetheless, the union movement in the 30s and 40s began to explicitly campaign for super, represented by the landmark win by the miners' union in 1938 after a 6-week-long strike. But let's fast forward a few decades to the 1980s. Many unions had established their own super funds. Most notably, the Building Industry Superannuation, or BUS, was founded by Australia's construction unions. As such, the unions were keen to get the then Hawke Labor government to make superannuation compulsory and universal. That meant that regardless of whether you worked on a union site or you were a doctor or a fast food worker, your employer was required to pay into your retirement. This system is largely unique to Australia, particularly its compulsory aspect. The fact that every worker is required to give up a portion, which nowadays is 12%, of their wages to go towards savings, and combined with the fact that it is invested to generate a return, has meant that Australia has one of the largest pools of cash in the world that has to be managed. And so what we know today as superannuation funds were founded to manage that money. Super, of course, as we went over, was never a union innovation. Back in the 19th century, large corporations and militaries would provide their white-collar workers and soldiers with superannuation. And so, despite some opposition within the world of business, the establishment and proliferation of superannuation in the 1980s was largely accepted across classes. To quote Building Workers Industrial Union Secretary Alf Zeno, super was alive and growing despite the efforts by some forces to kick it to death. The governance of superannuation firms reflects this collaboration between the union leadership and business. Let's look at one of the most innovative superannuation funds in the 1980s, and one we've just mentioned, BUS, built by the Builders Labourers Federation and the BWRU. The board consisted of 5 union representatives and 5 employer representatives. Today, while the spirit of equal representation of workers and owners remains, in practice, the majority of board members are employer or independently sponsored and appointed. This reflects the reality that even if you try and create an even playing field, the fact that the owner class, owns things, they own the companies which make up the economy, and in this case they pay the wages which in part flow towards the super funds they manage, that means over time, the scales will tilt more and more to their favor. And just quickly, because I've talked about it in numerous videos now, but remember, at the heart of our economy at its base is a fundamental conflict and antagonism, that being between the worker and their employer, the owner of the business. Workers want higher wages, better conditions, etc., but that all means less money for the owner. More money spent on wages and making the workplace nicer means less profit at the end of the day for the owner. But as we went over in part 1 to this video, there are ways in which workers can become subsumed, and so this conflict, this contradiction, can become internalized by the worker. Last time, we discussed at length as to why this is the case about property, but what about superannuation? Superannuation is the embodiment of this process of internalizing the primary contradiction into the worker. Just as property ownership ties the well-being of someone and their bank to the performance of the real estate market, superannuation ties the well-being of that now retired person to the performance of businesses, particularly large businesses on the stock market. This means a person who works a job who is in conflict with their boss is also simultaneously invested financially in the performance of the class that their boss belongs to. In other words, workers are financially incentivized into maintaining and supporting their own exploitation. This has made superannuation as a fraction of capital incredibly powerful. The more you integrate the well-being of working people with the performance of markets, which grow via their exploitation, the greater your ability is to pacify any kind of rebelliousness. For centuries, capitalist economies have reckoned with methods of pacifying working people, whether it be through outright violent suppression, subversion, media control, cultural domination. And while all of them have seen, varying levels of success and failure, a big lesson learned was that breaking the homogeneity of the working class was a necessary endeavor. In simple terms, breaking up the connections, the experiences, the ways in which working people relate to one another. That was necessary to defeat the collectivity and solidarity which drove many of the social movements that challenged capital. And what better way to do that than have the retirement of people be directly predicated upon a portfolio of investments which, say, were disrupted by strike action, would be in the bin. Some workers self-manage their funds. Many are increasingly interested in retail funds. Many are still loyal to their industry funds. All of these have varying portfolios and investment strategies. And of course, the performance of your super account is directly related to your salary during your working days. A surgeon with a self-managed fund would enjoy a pretty different retirement to a retail worker with rest, for example. It is from this position of integration that superannuation can exert itself as a potential hegemonic faction of Australian capitalism, which you can hardly describe the rise of superannuation capital as anything but meteoric. With its ability to pull together trillions of wages as investments and therefore its integral position within the working class, superannuation funds have become essential components of Australia's highly financialised economy. While the actual economic activity measurable in GDP is quite small, superannuation funds can collectively pull together over $4 trillion, nearly double total GDP. And not only is the structure of superannuation fantastic at stifling any sort of collective power working people have, but super has been integral to the lifeline of Australian capitalism in times of crisis. As put by then Treasurer and now Chair of Superfund CBUS, Wayne Swan, during the global financial crisis, super funds held about a quarter of equity on the ASX and contributed at least 48% of capital raised throughout the crisis to the recapitalisation of businesses. This essentially means that in a time where banks, investors and regular consumers were pulling back, where Australia's economy was being threatened by the global financial crisis, super funds provided the cash and confidence to businesses, to the financial system, which helped keep Australia above water and avoid the most consequential recession in the modern day. Today, a quarter of financial assets in this country are owned by superannuation firms, which means that Australia has a relatively secure non-banking financial sector. This is because in other countries, non-banking finance is made up of more high-risk, over-leveraged firms, whereas Australian super funds are more tightly regulated and are, by virtue of being retirement savings, operate on a long-term, low-risk basis. As put by the Reserve Bank, growth of the superannuation sector has increased its importance to the Australian financial system and economy. The sector's growth has supported the economy by helping Australians save for retirement and channeling those savings into return-generating investments, including providing long-term capital to Australian businesses. This hegemonic position enjoyed by superannuation has been entrenched by the fact that factionally, the sector is inextricably linked to the Australian Labor Party. Of course, by virtue of being forwarded as an initiative by union bureaucrats who themselves were close to the party, bureaucracies which themselves offered stable careerism for up-and-coming Labor Party officials, superannuation soon became a similar outfit. A common career progression from union official or Labour Party apparatchik is to go into superannuation. Take CBUS again. Current chair Wayne Swan was of course the treasurer to the Rudd Labour government, and his predecessor Steve Bracks was the Labour Premier for Victoria. Current chair of IFM Investors, who we'll talk about in a sec, was Kath Bowtell, a former Labour candidate for Melbourne. The web of financial ties and links doesn't end here though. Super funds often don't even manage their own assets in their entirety. For example, the top industry super funds in Australia own one of the world's largest asset managers, IFM Investors. Because industry super funds operate with an all profits and members model, these asset managers, who in contrast are for-profit firms, have the task of extracting rents or charging exorbitant fees to make their money. IFM operates as a conventional profit-orientated fund manager owned by super funds, which creates and markets investment vehicles, obtains funding commitments, and makes asset decisions. Management fees covering both operating costs and profit are charged to the investment vehicles, with the profits ultimately accruing to the industry fund owners of industry super holdings. So essentially, industry super funds can LARP on as, non-profits all they want, but in reality, those who manage the assets of their members are indeed for-profit firms. Over its lifetime, superannuation has grown significantly and consolidated. Australia used to have 40 industry super funds and now has half of that of 20. Super funds have gotten so big that simply just investing in the ASX in the Australian economy doesn't cut it anymore. They wouldn't be able to meet their targets. And this is why over the past few decades, superannuation funds have shifted more and more attention towards infrastructure and property. In 2013, Reddy et al. Argued that superannuation funds could increase their property allocation from 10% to 23%. In fact, to quote IFM Investors, there has never been a better time for industry super to invest in housing. The convergence between superannuation and property has been a long time in the making. As shown by the RBA in this paper here, the share of superannuation assets in government bonds has steadily fallen through the 1960s to the 1990s, and the share of assets held in equities and property has conversely risen over the same period. This trend has only continued, if not intensified, in recent times. In 1996, 15% of superannuation assets were held in the banks. Today, that number is over 25%. Just to reiterate, that means a quarter of your retirement income is predicated upon the performance of the big four banks. As mentioned in the last video, 60% of bank lending is tied to residential property, which, obviously makes up a huge portion of the profit banks make. Therefore, super funds, to grow their balances and increasing the share of their investments in the banks, rely on house prices to go up. They rely on banks to increase lending, to lend at higher and higher mortgages in order to meet their investment targets and fund our retirements. If you haven't put the dots together, this means superannuation funds are increasingly reliant on the housing market to grow in value, for housing to become more unaffordable to fund our retirements. The more unaffordable housing becomes, the bigger the super balance. This means the working class, who, remember from our last video are majority property owners, benefit twofold from housing unaffordability. They benefit as their largest asset, their home, grows in value, and they benefit in their retirement as their super balance grows in value. But as mentioned, big super funds and their asset managers like IFM are publicly announcing their intention to enter property development and real estate more formally. Beyond simply financially bolstering the banks, super funds are now increasingly interested in investing in housing directly. IFM's head of global external relations, David Whiteley, said super funds have been looking to invest in residential housing for decades, but until now, the economics did not stack up. And particularly with the current Albanese Labour government, superannuation funds have been a key player in the convergence between them, the state, and property. When you look at the signatories to the Albanese government's housing accord, you see both the biggest property lobby groups, a collection of the biggest industry super funds, and their biggest asset manager, IFM Investors. And so once you identify this engineered convergence between property, which again is a traditionally conservative wing of capital, and superannuation, a labourist wing of capital, you start to understand the motivations behind the Albanese government's housing policies. Take Albo's premier housing policy, the Housing Australia Future Fund. It took inspiration from the New South Wales then Liberal government's Social and Affordable Housing Fund, which invests a capital sum in revenue generating assets. The resulting returns underpin annual payments to approved consortia over 25-year terms. Most importantly, it includes repayment of construction debt raised from private financial institutions such as banks and superfunds. Similarly, for the HAF, it is understood that community housing organisations will secure private debt finance from institutional investors like superannuation funds to develop 30,000 units in the program's first 5 years, underpinned by government contracts for annual subsidy payments for 25 years. This is marked by the active involvement of various super funds with the policymaking process, who provided submissions while the Parliament was still deliberating on the legislation. And they put their money where their mouth was. CBUS dropped $500 million on the HAF. Australian Super and Hester, through their majority-owned developer Assemble, are also behind the HAF. IFM initially was keen on dropping $15 billion over 15 years, but pulled out due to the political instability the HAF is prone to. As pointed out by CBUS in their submission, having to rely on annual government approval is likely to significantly impact the appetite of investors to provide upfront capital. And at the time with a potential Liberal government looming, IFM called it quits. Other policies include direct funding boosts to Housing Australia, which is a separate government body that helps finance social housing units across the country. For example, since 2019, CBUS has put up $150 million in financing social housing through Housing Australia. Though this is breadcrumbs compared to CBUS's $5 billion direct investments into property broadly. Recently, the government announced a couple of different deposit reforms, the 5% deposit for first home buyers and the First Home Super Saver Scheme. That 5% deposit obviously allows first home buyers to save as little as 5% for a deposit on a home, which is incredibly profitable for the banks, as it means more customers who are in greater levels of debt to them, which of course increases the value of superannuation's investments in the banks. The First Home Super Saver Scheme is more directly beneficial to superannuation funds. It allows someone to put additional money into their super with the intention of saving for a deposit. Concessional contributions to super, like this scheme, only get taxed at 15%, which is well below most income brackets. And if you're explicitly putting those contributions towards a deposit for a first home, you get an additional 30% tax offset. Not a financial advice guy, but if you're saving for a house, it's essentially free money from the government. Even on a state level, super funds are key stakeholders in government decision making. Leaked documents reveal that when deciding to knock down the inner city Melbourne public housing towers, big industry super fund representatives and of course our friends at IFM were all there in the room. More broadly, the Victorian government's landmark affordability partnership features both property heavyweights like the Property Council of Australia, Master Builders Victoria, the Urban Development Institute of Australia, the Housing Industry Association, and super fund partnerships, which is owned by Australian Super and Hester. It is the developments of the two titans of Australian capitalism, property and superannuation, which has characterized the trajectory of our lives, our economy, our politics, and our society. The growing relationship between these two hegemons will therefore determine the future of such. To quote academics John Bellamy Foster and French Magdoff in their book The Great Financial Crisis, capitalism in its monopoly finance capital phase has become increasingly reliant on the ballooning of the credit debt system in order to escape the worst aspects of stagnation, which, as we can see by the ever-growing prevalence of super in the economy to the point where it's saving us from economic crises, is completely correct. To sort of recap everything we spoke about in a few minutes, superannuation is the primary retirement savings system in Australia, and historically, superannuation funds were created by unions. These funds existed to pull together contributions of portions of workers' wages to then invest across the economy and grow in value. As superannuation was made compulsory across the entire economy and not just in unionized workplaces, the task of superannuation funds likewise grew. Today, this means that superfunds control $4 trillion in workers' wages, which they invest all across the economy. Ultimately, this means that the retirements of working people who are exploited under the capitalist mode of production, who are in an antagonistic relationship with their boss, the owner class, is predicated upon the success of that class over working people. More succinctly, the antagonistic dynamic between worker and owner has become internalized by workers. Their interest as a class itself has become contradictory. This embedment within the working class and its ability to mobilize literally trillions of dollars of potential investment has made superannuation Australia's fastest growing and amongst the most influential factions of capital. Super's gotten so big that just merely investing in Australian publicly traded stocks is insufficient. This has motivated Super's shift towards real estate, a market worth over $10 trillion. And as such, we're beginning to see the convergence of two previously distantly related yet similarly situated factions of capital. Proponents of this system, typically members of the Labor Party, will defend such an arrangement as integral to the success of Australia over other countries like the US or the UK. After all, the strength of Australian superannuation and its financial system underpinned by housing investment helped keep the global financial crisis at bay. However, the good times never last forever. The higher the climb, the steeper the fall. I'll finish here by quoting Hyman Minsky, one of the most innovative economists in the field of finance. Over periods of prolonged prosperity, the economy transits from financial relations that make for a stable system to financial relations that make for an unstable system. In particular, over a protracted period of good times, capitalist economies tend to move from a financial structure dominated by hedge finance units to a structure in which there is a large weight of units engaged in speculative and Ponzi finance.